Eternal Darkness, my personal favorite, was one of 552 games that were officially released for the Nintendo GameCube in North America. Collectively, those games sold more than 133 million units during an active system life of just over 2,000 days. In this video, I take a deep dive and look at the numbers behind those numbers. Using a variety of statistical techniques, I explore a series of questions about GameCube game sales, so that by the end of this video, I can come to some solid conclusions about which factor was the most important in driving game sales. And along the way, I'm going to pay special attention to the statistical selling power of the most recognizable members of the Nintendo family. I've often heard that the GameCube is considered to be Nintendo's Dreamcast, in that it undersold but over-delivered. And speaking from my own personal experience, I can say that I found the system to be one of the very best I've ever played. But this video isn't about that story. Instead, this video is going to dive into the numbers and explore game sales from a statistical point of view. And to do that, I developed a statistical model, more specifically a negative binomial regression model, to better understand the relationships between the things that affected game sales on the GameCube. So as to not bring this video to a grinding halt with my methods, more details on the regression model and data sources can be found in the video description. The dependent variable in this analysis, the thing that we ultimately care about explaining, is the sales level of a given GameCube game. The point here is to better understand why one game sold X amount of copies and another only sold Y amount. This difference is what we hope to explain by using the independent or explanatory variables. And those explanatory variables include things like a game genre, publisher, release date, and a number of others. These are the variables by which we can construct our analysis. Now, I have to openly admit that while I worked hard to include as many explanatory variables as I could, it's guaranteed that I'm missing some that would have likely increased the power of this analysis. Some of those things are just not possible to acquire without a massive amount of additional research and, more importantly, access. Like, for example, the amount of money that was spent on promotion for each game. And this is the biggest potential issue with my analysis. If I've missed critical variables, then my results will not be as good as they could have been. Having said all of that, I do think that this model offers us some insight into the issue of game sales on the GameCube. Around 90% of GameCube games, those represented by this graphic, sold less than 600,000 units. The other 10%, out here and beyond, can be considered outliers in the dataset, and we'll get to those in a moment. About a quarter of games sold less than 50,000 units on the GameCube, while the parameters of this red box show that about half of all GameCube games sold between 50,000 and 265,000 copies. The median game, represented by that white line, sold 115,000 copies. And the other 25%, they sold more than that, including this big bulk of about 80 games in this range. And for the rest of the big sellers, it's time to zoom out and take a quick look at those outliers. Each of these red dots represents a game that sold more than 600,000 units. And what we see is that even these outliers have outliers. These three games way out here are considered extreme, selling many more copies than the rest of the data. Can you guess what they are? Of course, they're all Mario-related games: Sunshine, Double Dash, and Melee. It's our first glimpse of the power of what I'm going to call the family. But before we move on, and though this analysis doesn't focus on hardware sales, it's more than worth pointing out that nearly 13 million GameCubes were sold in North America. And given that more than 133 million games were sold for the system in North America, this gives the GameCube an impressive tie ratio of over 10 games per system. And that's one of, if not the highest tie ratio for any Nintendo hardware, and certainly a measure of strong fan support for the system, a sentiment we'll learn more about in the next section. One of the simplest and most striking findings in this analysis is just how consistently well supported the system's games were by GameCube owners. You don't need a regression model to see this. Case in point, this is a simple scatter plot with a game's release date on the horizontal axis and that game's total sales on the vertical axis. And as we add all of the individual games, those red dots, year by year, we see that there is no cliff. Of course, sales are generally very high for those games released in the system's first couple of years, but there's not a real massive downward trend until we get to 2007, which had only a smattering of releases. And on the flip side of the coin, if we remove all of the games except for those published by Nintendo, we can see that Nintendo returned the favor to its fans and themselves supported the system with a steady flow of games right up until the end. These three games up here are those three extreme outliers that we just mentioned, Melee, Double Dash, and Sunshine. But don't worry, Zelda fans, 2 of the Zelda games managed sales of over 1 million copies. Pretty damn big. While we're on this screen, let's also quickly take a look at one other publisher, Sega. Like Nintendo, Sega supported the GameCube pretty much from start to finish, with a big chunk of games, including these 7 Sonic games, which all sold very well, and the other big sellers for Sega, Super Monkey Ball 1 and 2. As somebody that grew up on Sega versus Nintendo, this is all a little strange to see. Now let's look at consumer support from a slightly different angle. Average game sales by year. What we see is that after the launch year, average game sales across all years of the system's life are remarkably consistent, without any of the big dips that you might expect as a system ages, meaning that, on average, each game was very well supported throughout the system's lifespan. Of course, fewer and fewer games were released later in that lifespan, so total sales by year do tail off. But I feel the more important part of this story is the consistency in those average sales. Now, whereas the analysis of release dates so far has been based on simple descriptive statistics comparing averages across categories of time, we can now introduce the regression model to take a closer look. And the main power of regression is that it allows us to disentangle the effects of one variable from the effects of all the others. So in this instance, it lets us control for all of those other explanatory variables that we mentioned earlier and isolate just the effect of a game's release date on sales, so that we can make a claim about the impact of when a game came out, accounting for other things. And when we do this, we can predict that a game released in the first 2 years of the GameCube's life can be predicted to sell roughly 40% more copies than one released in the middle of the system's life. But perhaps more importantly, there was no real statistical difference in sales levels for games released late in the system's life as compared to the middle years. This finding completely supports the notion that GameCube owners were very supportive of the system throughout its life cycle and did not abandon the system as it entered its later years. The GameCube seemingly had something for everyone, with a good selection of games across all categories. Now, RPGs might look a little light at just 5% of the library, but that's a big step up from the Nintendo 64, where only around 2% of games were RPGs. And if we look at average game sales across those categories, we see some interesting data. Fighting games, driven by the massive success of Smash Bros. And Soul Calibur 2, lead the pack in average sales. RPGs have a very high average, above 300,000, while sports games are dead last at just around 170,000. This is the biggest surprise to me, as usually sports games sell very well and represent some of the biggest sellers on a given console. If we exchange these averages for totals, we see a different picture. Action-adventure games, by virtue of being so numerous on the system, hold the highest sales total, while fighting games and RPGs both have low totals due to having relatively very few games on the system. However, when we use the regression model to hold all of the other variables constant and just look at the impact of a game genre on sales, something surprising happens. What we find is that genre really isn't statistically significant in impacting sales, with one exception, a big one. Sports games can be predicted to sell nearly 50% fewer copies than action-adventure games. And I'm using action-adventure games as the reference category because that's the category with the most games in it. Now this sports game finding is a surprise to me because my experience in analyzing other systems has taught me that sports games, by and large, can be predicted to sell many more copies than other genres. For example, on the Dreamcast, sports games could be predicted to sell 50% more than action games, but that's just not the case on the GameCube. Nintendo published nearly 50 games on the GameCube, but they weren't the most prolific publisher, not even close, as we'll see in a minute. From the third-party perspective, a number of publishers put out at least 10 games on the system, but some were a lot more active than others. Of these publishers, 5 of them produced what I would consider to be a large amount of games on the system. THQ and Ubisoft both spit out over 30 games, while Activision hit 42, and stunningly, EA published nearly 90 games on the system, nearly double the amount that Nintendo themselves produced. But for me, the most interesting publisher here, of course, is Sega, with just over 30 games on the system. Think about that for a minute. Bitter enemies just a few years earlier, and now on the GameCube, Sega and Nintendo are collaborating to make a large number of Sega games available on a Nintendo system. It was crazy then, and it still seems strange to me now. How do you think Sonic felt about all this? When we look at the average sales between Nintendo and everybody else, it's not even close. Nintendo games averaged nearly 1 million in sales per game, versus less than 200,000 for everybody else. And if we drill down a level on this data and separate Nintendo games into 2 camps, those featuring at least one key member of the Nintendo family and those that do not, the difference in averages is even more extreme, with those games featuring one of the members of the family averaging nearly 1.4 million copies sold. And if we look at averages by specific third-party publishers, we see more interesting stuff. THQ and EA both had a great time on the system, producing a lot of games and games with high average sales. I don't think it'll surprise too many people that Acclaim, Midway, and Ubisoft are down at the bottom of the averages ranking. But let's go back up to the top of the chart for my favorite statistic. Sega was number 2 in average sales, with over 300,000 units sold per game, far ahead of everybody else and only trailing Nintendo. If we switch these averages to totals, we get an idea of the relative importance of each company toward the overall health of the GameCube. Behind Nintendo, EA with their 88 games was always going to be the most important from a total sales perspective. But again, look at Sega, basically in a tie with THQ for total sales and only trailing EA in overall importance to the GameCube's life. Stunning stuff. And I'm speculating that these massive sales likely played a key role in Sega staying afloat after the Dreamcast went under. When we use the regression model to control for all of the other variables and just look at the impact of a game's publisher, we get a clearer picture of each company's impact. First, note that the category with the largest number of games published was the Other category, meaning games put out by publishers with less than 10 games to their name on the system. And like with the action-adventure genre earlier, this will be our reference category by which we'll compare publishers. So all else held constant, a game published by THQ could be predicted to sell on average 122% more copies than a game published by one of the publishers in the Other category. A game from Activision, 140% more. A game from EA, 170%. A game from Sega, 190% more. Huge. And, not surprisingly, a game from Nintendo, a massive 600% more. And if we take an extra step and factor the family into the regression analysis, we can say that a Nintendo game featuring one of the members of the family can be predicted to sell an amazing 900% more units than a game published by one of the publishers in the Other category. The selling power of the family is undeniable. For the purposes of analyzing the relationship between review scores and game sales, I'm going to use a game's IGN score. I realize that this isn't the most ideal measure of game quality, but the two things I like about IGN review scores are that number one, they review nearly every game, and crucially number two, those reviews are usually available before or on the day of a game's release date, so that in theory, those review scores could be the cause of the effect, in this case a game's sale. Here's a basic scatterplot with IGN score on the horizontal axis and game sales on the vertical. When we add in the games, we do see a very gentle, positive relationship between IGN score and sales. As IGN score goes up, sales tend to go up. Statistically speaking, this correlation's value is 0.28. And amazingly, this is the exact same correlation value that I got in my Dreamcast analysis. 3 games in particular caught my eye on this graphic. First, of course, is this lonely dot way over here. With a 1.1 IGN score, this game still managed to sell nearly 200,000 units, way above the median game sales. It's Nickelodeon Party Blast, a game featuring SpongeBob, Rugrats, Jimmy Neutron, and others. A licensed game. And you'll see in our next section the importance of licensed games. The other 2 games that you could say beat the odds with pretty awful review scores were over here. Namco Museum, with nearly 500,000 in sales on a 4.0 review, and Yu-Gi-Oh! The Falsebound Kingdom, with similar high sales on an even worse 3.5 score. Just for fun, let's strip away all of the third-party games and take a quick look at just the Nintendo games. As expected, the bulk of Nintendo games have high review scores and high sales. But there is one particular game that caught my attention here. This guy way down here, with a nearly perfect IGN score and yet very low sales relative to the other games with that kind of score. It's Eternal Darkness, one of my absolute favorite games on the system. Possibly an underappreciated gem from the look of this. The average IGN score for GameCube games was around a 7.0, but if we drill down and look at average review scores for each of the big publishers, it leaves me a little baffled. Now, it's not baffling that Nintendo has a high average score, but it is somewhat puzzling that EA, with nearly 90 games, could have an 8.0 average. And statistically speaking, EA games actually had less variation in review scores than did Nintendo games. This could be due to the fact that so many EA games were sports games, and sports games on average had high review scores, but there's still nearly 4 dozen EA games that weren't sports games. Meanwhile, Sega, Midway, Activision, and Capcom were all at or around a 7, while the remainder of publishers languished with less than stellar averages. I don't think I would have ever guessed that Konami would be way at the bottom of these rankings. Moving on, if we collapse review scores into 2 categories, those that scored an 8 or higher versus those that scored lower than an 8, we see huge differences in average sales. Those with glowing reviews had nearly 200,000 more sales on average. Carrying this into the regression model, and just looking at the impact of review scores while holding all of the other variables constant, we see that on average, a game with a high IGN score, an 8 or higher, can be predicted to sell 95% more copies than a game with a lower score. Every system has them, apparently stretching back to the arcades in 1976 with Sega's release of Fonz, a racing game based around Fonzie from Happy Days. And beginning in 2001, the GameCube was no different. The system had plenty of licensed games. In fact, the GameCube had a ton of them. By my count, somewhere in the neighborhood of 24% of GameCube games are licensed games. Games based on either comic book or movie properties. Such games often get hammered in reviews, because for every GoldenEye, there are a dozen Charlie's Angels. On the GameCube, average IGN scores for non-licensed versus licensed games are nearly a full point apart. And if you'd like to know who the biggest offenders were, this graphic tells us the percentage of licensed games by publisher. Over 70% of Atari's games on the GameCube were based on licensed properties. THQ, more than 50% of their games. As a Sega fan, it makes me happy to see that Sega's way down on the list, with just 6% of their games being licensed. But despite how crappy they often are, average game sales are not that far apart between the 2 categories. In fact, licensed games on average only sell about 35,000 less copies than non-licensed. And once we introduce the regression model to hold constant all of the other variables and just isolate the impact of licensing, something really weird happens. We see that licensed games can actually be predicted to sell nearly 50% more copies than non-licensed games. Now this flies in the face of the graphic we just saw on differences in averages, but that just tells us that there are other things driving that difference in averages, and that licensing actually does have a slightly positive impact on sales. Now clearly this is something that big companies have known about for a long time, because licensing is just a part of gaming life. We've made it to the final explanatory variable, and it's yet another excuse to show my favorite GameCube game. Nintendo has always been great about providing a number of exclusives for their system, and the GameCube was no exception. And to be clear, my definition of exclusive is that the game was exclusive to the system at the time of release. In the years since the GameCube's demise, many of these games have of course been ported to other systems. Comparing average sales between exclusives and non-exclusives, the exclusives games sell an average of 400,000 more copies. Exclusives made up just about 20% of the GameCube's library, but those games accounted for 45% of total game sales. Massive. When we use the regression model to control for all of the other variables, we see that on average, system exclusives can be predicted to sell 60% more copies than non-exclusives. And you might be wondering, why is that so seemingly low given the big difference in averages that we just saw? And again, the reason is that other variables are apparently more responsible for that big difference. Probably the fact that most of the exclusives are Nintendo published games. And in fact, if we check that, we see that that's exactly right. 96% of Nintendo published games were exclusive to the system. Capcom and Sega also both had high percentages of system exclusives, while Acclaim, EA, Midway, and Vivendi all have exactly 0. In the end, each of our explanatory variables did seem to have some impact on game sales. While licensing had impact, I'm not comfortable saying much more than that. And a game's quality, as measured by high review scores, also seemed to move the needle to quite a large effect, but still, that doesn't seem like the biggest influence. And genre? Well, we can say that sports games can be predicted to sell poorly relative to action games, but that's not really a conclusion with any meat. Exclusivity certainly was important, as was whether or not the game was released in the first 2 years of the system's life, but they just weren't all that massive in magnitude. But a game's publisher? Now that was big. The fact that games published by Sega could be predicted to sell nearly 200% more than those games produced by the other category of publishers, and that Nintendo games could be predicted to sell 600% more, is huge. And the family? Well, they're on another level entirely, with a massive impact on sales, to the tune of nearly 900% more in average expected sales versus those games produced by the other category, making a game's publisher and the family the most important variables in this model by a mile. I really wish that I had access to data on each game's promotional budget, as I feel that there's likely a lot of noise in the publisher variable that could be disentangled and isolated with that data. But we may never have that data, so in the meantime, I feel comfortable that this analysis at least gives us some insight into software sales on the GameCube. If you've made it this far in my video, then statistically speaking, I'd wager that there's a high likelihood you'd enjoy my other content, so please consider a subscription. Thank you for watching, all the best, and the sky is the limit.